don't enter my house! Don't eat me! I am human!
Pick the hammer and fight with me! Fight to the enemy! Go, go, go!
It began not with a roar, but with a vibration, low, guttural, and alive. The ground itself seemed to shudder as if remembering an old terror. The dust that had settled over the ruins of Vargan rose once again, trembling in the stale air. We had been stationed there for 11 days without contact from orbit. 11 days of silence, broken only by the faint hum of the auspex and the occasional whisper of wind across shattered ferrocrete. The Emperor's light had not touched this place for years, but we held fast because that was what guardsmen did. We held until someone told us not to. That morning, the light was wrong. The sun, if you could still call it that, hung dull and swollen, its color choked by ash drifting from the manufacturum fields to the east. The smell of burned oil and wet metal seeped into everything. Our armor, our throats, even our prayers. I remember Private Loran saying it felt like the world was rotting from the inside out. He was right, and when the Vox finally crackled with movement to the west, we all knew it wasn't going to be relief. It was them, the Orks. There's a sound they make before the battle even starts. Before you see the dust, before you smell the engine fumes or hear the guttural laughter. It's a kind of rhythm, a pounding that starts as a distant thump and becomes a living heartbeat under the soil. You feel it in your ribs before your ears can name it. It is the sound of inevitability. When it came that day, I remember gripping my laser gun so tightly the knuckles turned white. No order was given. No one needed to speak. We just turned toward the sound like animals hearing the approach of something too big to fight. The first thing we saw wasn't an orc. It was one of their machines. A crude, smoke-belching monstrosity that looked more like a moving scrapyard than a weapon. Plates of scavenged armor were bolted together in jagged layers, daubed with symbols in red paint that looked suspiciously like blood. It screeched as it moved, metal grinding against metal. Then came the laughter, raw, booming, almost joyful. Dozens of voices, then hundreds. The green tide had come to Vargan 9. The first shells landed short, kicking up gouts of dirt and burning promethium. Our commander, Halen, barked orders through the Vox. Steady fire, controlled bursts. But no discipline could stop the panic that came with seeing that many orcs charging across the field. They didn't advance like soldiers. They came like a storm, uncoordinated, screaming, and yet terrifyingly unified by one thing: hunger for war. I remember the heat of my laser gun as I fired again and again, the world narrowing to the bright red flash of discharge and the acrid tang of ozone. Orcs fell, some bursting apart, others merely slowing down before rising again, bellowing louder. They were too many. You could cut down 10, and 20 more would rise from behind the wreckage, their crude armor gleaming with oil and blood. They say the orcs are chaos given form, but that's only half true. There's something horribly pure about them. No doubt, no hesitation, no fear. They live for the fight. They are the fight. And when you see them up close, the wild, bloodshot eyes, the tusks slick with saliva, you realize something that never leaves you. They enjoy it. Every second of it. We fell back to the ruins of the old hab blocks, our voxnet screaming with overlapping voices. The orcs were already flanking us, using speed that shouldn't have belonged to creatures their size. I saw Loran take a slug to the chest. It hit like a sledgehammer, armor cracking open like paper. He was dead before he hit the ground. There was no time to drag him back. You don't look for the fallen in a tide like that. You just keep firing and pray you'll have a body left to bless later. As the hours dragged on, the smoke grew so thick it turned the day into twilight. Promethium fires painted the sky in shades of orange and black. The smell of burning flesh, human and orc alike, hung heavy. My respirator filters were clogged with soot, every breath tasting of iron. Commander Halen's voice was still on the Vox, calm as ever. "Hold the line," he said, like it meant something anymore. "The Emperor watches." I wanted to believe that. We all did. But even faith has limits when the green tide rises high enough to drown the stars. By dusk, we were down to half strength. The wounded screamed for medici that weren't coming. Vox reports said the next bastion had already fallen, no survivors. Reinforcements? None. Evac? Denied. The High Command had decided Vargan 9 wasn't worth the munitions to save. We were to delay the enemy. That's what the message said. Delay. As if you could delay a storm with sandbags. When night fell, the orcs didn't stop. They never do. They fight in the dark as easily as under daylight. Maybe better. Their eyes glow faintly in the shadows, catching what little light there is and reflecting it back like feral animals. We took refuge inside the shell of an old manufactorum, barricading doors with debris. The air inside was thick with dust and the bitter tang of machine oil. Somewhere deeper in the complex, a generator still sputtered weakly, sending out a dying pulse of light. We heard them outside, laughing, tearing apart what was left of our perimeter. One of them, larger than the rest, wearing a crude metal helm shaped like a skull, stood silhouetted in the doorway. He carried a cleaver almost as long as my body, streaked with blood that steamed in the cold air. He said something in that harsh, snarling tongue of theirs, then kicked the barricade aside like it was made of paper. The others followed. What came next wasn't a battle. It was a slaughter. Lasfire barely slowed them. You could burn a hole through one's chest and he'd still come swinging, roaring with laughter. I remember shooting one square in the face. The head burst, and still the body stumbled forward, arms flailing. The stink of them, sweat, rot, gunpowder, filled the air until it felt like drowning in filth. I don't remember much after that. Just flashes, the clang of metal on metal, the sound of someone screaming my name, the sight of Halen impaled on a jagged piece of rebar, still clutching his vox bead, trying to call command. When I came to, the manufactorum was quiet, except for the crackle of fire and the distant rumble of orc engines retreating. Or maybe regrouping. Hard to tell which was worse. I dragged myself to the surface sometime near dawn. The world above was unrecognizable. The horizon glowed with the light of distant explosions, and the air was alive with the droning hum of orc aircraft. Ramshackle things that looked more like flying junk heaps than machines. They painted the sky in trails of black smoke as they strafed what remained of the city. There were corpses everywhere. Guardsmen, civilians, even a few Mechanicus adepts torn apart near the data spires. The orcs hadn't looted much. They rarely do, not yet. First they destroy. Looting comes later, once they've had their fill of blood. I stumbled toward what had once been the comms relay, my leg dragging uselessly behind me. The Vox was dead. The data slate I carried flickered, showing only static and fragments of old transmission logs. I remember one line repeating in a corrupted loop, "Oh, the green tide cannot be contained." That was when I realized the truth. Vargan 9 wasn't a battlefield. It was a seedbed. The orcs weren't just here to kill us. They were here to grow. In the Warhammer universe, worlds like ours die quietly. They don't make it into the great histories of the Imperium. No one writes songs for them. The Administratum will stamp a seal over the report, mark it as exterminatus risk pending, and move on. But I remember that day because I saw what the Imperium refuses to admit. The orcs are endless, because they don't need victory. Every battle, every corpse, every drop of blood spilled feeds the next war. They are the only species in the galaxy that truly worships the fight itself. And in that, maybe they are the most honest. When I looked east, toward the rising light of another burning manufactorum, I saw their banners fluttering in the smoke, crude red glyphs daubed on metal sheets, hammered into the ground like insults to sanity. Around them, the orcs moved tirelessly, dragging bodies, fixing weapons, roaring with laughter. They had lost hundreds, maybe thousands, and it didn't matter. To them, the battle was still young. I remember something old from the catechisms of the Astra Militarum. Fear not the alien's strength, but the endurance of his will. Standing there, watching that endless horde rearm for another day of slaughter, I finally understood what that meant. We fight for duty, for faith, for survival. The orcs fight because they cannot imagine not fighting. The galaxy itself is just their arena. The wind shifted, carrying the stench of promethium and blood. My vox clicked once, faint and broken, a ghost signal from some distant survivor. I almost laughed, because even if I answered, what could I say? That Vargan had fallen? That we had been devoured by something that doesn't know how to stop? Words mean nothing in the face of that kind of hunger. I sat down among the ruins, the heat of the fires warming my armor, and waited. For rescue, for death, for the next wave. It didn't matter which came first. The orcs would return soon enough. They always do. And somewhere out there, beyond the horizon, the green tide gathered strength once more. An endless, roaring chorus that rose to greet the dying dawn. By the time the second sun rose above the blackened ridges of Vargan, the world had changed. The wind no longer carried the scent of soil or smoke. It carried spores, fine, green dust that glimmered faintly in the dying light. It settled on every surface, crept into cracks, soaked into wounds. The medica used to warn us about it, back when the command still sent out bulletins. Burn the bodies, they said. Never let them rot. We didn't understand why then. Now I do. The orcs don't just conquer. They infest. The Manufactorum ruins where I'd taken shelter had turned into a graveyard. The fires had long since burned out, leaving only the soft hiss of ash shifting under its own weight. I moved through the wreckage in silence, stepping over melted helmets and broken lasguns, the smell of death clinging to my tongue. Somewhere beneath the rubble, the faint thrum of machinery still pulsed, half-dead systems running on inertia, a relic heartbeat of a world already claimed. I found a voxcaster buried under a collapsed support beam. Its casing cracked, but its signal lamp flickering faintly. Static poured from the receiver, interspersed with fragments of speech, voices, distorted, calling for retreat. Then laughter that wasn't human. I twisted the dial, and through the noise came a phrase I'll never forget. They're sprouting from the mud now. Emperor, save us. They're growing out of the ground. I shut it off. There are some things you can't hear twice. The air outside shimmered faintly in the heat. Across the plain, I saw the orcs rebuilding already. Where we saw defeat, they saw opportunity. Their machines, those ugly, smoke-belching things, were being patched together from the wreckage of our tanks. Guardsman armor, scorched and twisted, now adorned their vehicles like trophies. A half-burnt banner bearing the Aquila flapped limply on the side of a looted chimera, now painted red and black. They worked fast, too fast. I watched them tear apart wrecks and corpses alike, laughing, roaring, sometimes fighting among themselves just to see who'd hit harder. And every time one fell, another rose to take his place. It was as if the planet itself was breeding them. I made my way toward the old refinery ridge, what was left of it. The sky above shimmered with green contrails as orc fighter bombers screamed through the clouds, engines sputtering but somehow never dying. I passed what had once been a defensive line. Sandbags torn open, heavy bolters twisted from overheat, bodies turned to charcoal from point-blank promethium fire. The orcs hadn't just attacked, they'd stayed. They'd claimed the ground, made it their camp, their home, their temple of war. A single orc stood on the ridge, taller than any I'd seen before. His armor was jagged, plates of scavenged ceramite bolted over muscle and scar tissue. He carried a massive iron pole with a skull impaled on it. Human, maybe Cadian. I watched through the cracked lens of my visor as he lifted it to the sky and roared. The others answered, 1,000 throats bellowing at once. The sound rolled through the valley like thunder. I'd seen organized armies before, Imperial Guard, Astartes detachments, even Mechanicus cohorts. They moved with purpose, with order. The orcs moved with instinct, yet their chaos had rhythm, a terrifying harmony born of shared hunger. It was not strategy, it was nature. As I descended the ridge, I found something half buried in the mud. A vox bead, still transmitting faintly. I pressed it to my ear. A woman's voice crackled through, strained and trembling. This is Lieutenant Sarah Vale, 3rd Battalion, Vargan 9 PDF. If anyone hears this, Emperor, protect us. They've overrun the North Bastion. The ground, it's moving. They're not coming from ships anymore. They're growing. The spores! By the throne, they're... The transmission ended in static and screaming metal. I dropped the bead. Around me, the ground had begun to tremble again. Not the distant rumble of artillery, but something closer, deeper. I knelt, pressing my gloved hand to the dirt. It was warm. Alive. Tiny vibrations pulsed through it, faint, but rhythmic. Something beneath the surface. And then I saw it. A crack forming in the mud, green light spilling from within like rot made visible. A shape pushed upward, slow at first, then violent. A hand, thick and clawed, slick with slime. Then another. The creature hauled itself from the ground, roaring with life. An orc, newborn from the soil itself. Eyes still milky from growth, lungs filling for the first time, and laughing. That's when the horror of it truly settled in. You can kill an orc, you can burn a horde, but you can't kill what's already seated in the world. They don't need fleets. They don't need leaders. They just need time, and the galaxy gives them plenty. I fell back, stumbling over debris, the newborn orc turning its gaze toward me. It wasn't armed yet, but it didn't need to be. The hunger in its eyes was enough. I raised my lasgun, fired once, twice. The second shot found its mark, burning through the skull. The body collapsed, steaming, and the ground quivered where it fell. The soil drank it like rainwater. By dusk, the wind had shifted again, carrying with it that same faint dust. Millions of microscopic seeds drifting on unseen currents. It glittered faintly in the fading light, beautiful if you didn't know what it was. Death wearing the face of nature. I took shelter inside the remains of an administratum outpost that night. The walls were covered in faded parchment sigils, edicts of control and faith, now stained with blood. I found a broken data slate still flickering with partial files. Someone had been recording observations before the collapse. Spore density increasing exponentially. Suspected life cycle independent of reproductive structures. Initial contact results in accelerated mutation of local fauna and flora. Probability of full planetary contamination, 97.4%. They knew. The Mechanicus had known what the orcs were capable of. They just hadn't expected it to happen this fast. I tried to sleep, but the night was alive with sound. Orc laughter carried over the plains, distant yet constant. Occasionally, the scream of a dying beast, or man, cut through the air, followed by roaring approval. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that newborn face rising from the mud. At some point, exhaustion claimed me. When I woke, the world outside glowed green under the light of a rising moon, thick clouds veiling its surface. The air was heavy, almost gelatinous with moisture and spores. My armor's filters clicked weakly, warning of overload. I ignored it. There was no point conserving purity in a place already damned. I moved east, toward what used to be the riverline. It wasn't water anymore, just sludge, thick and dark, rippling faintly with movement beneath the surface. I thought I saw shapes down there, shadows of orcoid growths pulsing like organs. The river itself had become their womb. Across the bank, a group of orcs was gathered around a fire, the flickering light casting their hulking silhouettes onto the ruins. They were arguing, gesturing wildly, shoving each other. It wasn't rage, it was joy. They were alive in the only way they knew how. Every argument was a celebration, every punch a form of love. Their laughter filled the night, deep and unending. I stayed low, watching them. One of them, smaller than the rest, maybe a mech or a grot overseer, was fiddling with some kind of weapon. Sparks flew as it welded together two scraps of metal, the firelight reflecting in its gleaming eyes. There was intelligence there, brutal, primal, but real. A kind of genius born from chaos. That's when I realized something else. The orcs don't just fight endlessly because they must. They fight because creation and destruction are the same thing to them. Every act of violence builds something new, something bigger, louder, stronger. It's a cycle that feeds itself, a fire that spreads itself. Somewhere in the distance, a massive explosion tore the horizon apart. The orcs cheered, raising their crude weapons to the sky. I could see their war banners silhouetted in the firelight, glowing like blasphemous stars. And beneath that light, I saw movement, lines of new orcs marching from the mist, their bodies still glistening with moisture, eyes burning with instinct. The green tide had no end. I turned away, moving through the ruins as quietly as possible. My vox clicked once, then twice. A faint signal came through, a human voice. "This is Captain Bren of the 19th Vostroyan, holding position near the southern mag rail. Survivors report." Repeat, "Any survivors report." For a moment I froze. A voice, a living voice. I keyed the transmitter, whispering into the static. "This is Sergeant Corrin, 2nd Cadian, holding East Ridge. No contact with command. The orcs, they're breeding in the soil. You need to burn everything," the line hissed, then fell silent. Finally, a faint reply. "Acknowledged, Sergeant. Emperor protect. We're preparing a strike. Hold until we signal." I wanted to believe that meant help was coming. But as the green glow grew brighter across the horizon and the wind carried the laughter of thousands more orcs into the night, I knew the truth. The Imperium doesn't rescue worlds like this. It purges them. The vox fell silent again. I sat there, staring at the device, wondering how much of me was already contaminated. My armor was caked in spore dust. My wounds still oozed faintly through the bandages. Maybe the infection wasn't just physical. Maybe it was something deeper. The creeping realization that the orcs' madness made more sense than our faith. They fought for what they loved. We fought for survival. Who was stronger in the end? The next morning, the world was green. Not the green of life, but of infestation. The horizon shimmered with clouds of spores, sunlight filtering through them like through stained glass. In the distance, the bombardment began at dawn, though dawn itself was only a rumor beneath the choking haze. The sky had turned the color of old copper, bleeding into a pale, sickly green where the orc spores had thickened enough to dim the sun. The first shell fell miles away, a faint bloom of light swallowed by clouds. But soon the earth was shaking under every step, and the air vibrated with the sound of Imperial wrath. I thought it would bring relief. It didn't. The shells fell without pattern, without mercy, scouring friend and foe alike. The Imperium doesn't aim for precision when it decides a world is lost. It aims for silence. I'd taken shelter in what used to be a cargo tunnel running beneath the refinery district. The walls were slick with condensation, the air metallic, heavy with the stink of oil and decay. Every impact sent a rain of dust and pebbles tumbling from the ceiling. The Vox was dead again, just a steady hiss of static. Outside, the roar of the guns was constant, but beneath it, if you listened close, you could still hear the orcs. Their laughter carried through even the thunder. I wasn't alone down there. A few others had made it into the tunnel before the surface collapsed. 3 guardsmen from different regiments, a wounded Mechanicus engine seer, and a child who must have been hiding in the hab blocks when the fighting began. She couldn't have been more than 10. No one knew her name. She didn't speak. Her face was gray with ash, her eyes wide and empty, like someone who had already seen too much. The engine seer, his name was Galvan, kept muttering to himself, his mechadendrites twitching in the dark. He'd lost one leg, replaced it with a crude splint of rebar and cabling. "They're in the systems," he said once, voice filtered through the Vox grill in his throat. "The machines remember the orcs, the scrap code's infected." No one asked what he meant. None of us wanted to know. The bombardment intensified. The tunnels groaned under the strain. Somewhere deeper, a pipe burst, flooding part of the corridor with steaming water. We moved back, clinging to what little light we had left. 2 flickering glow rods, and the faint red gleam from Galvan's optics. Private Sorn, a wiry man with a hollow voice, was the first to speak what we were all thinking. "They won't stop until nothing's left," he said. "Not them, not the orcs, not us," no one answered. The truth didn't need a reply. After hours of bombardment, the sound changed. The shells stopped falling. The silence that followed was worse. It wasn't peace, it was waiting. Then, faint at first, came another sound. Engines. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. A deep, mechanical roar that seemed to come from every direction. Galvan tilted his head, the servos in his neck whirring softly. "Orkoid flyers," he whispered. "They've adapted to the bombardment." I didn't want to believe him. But when we reached a maintenance hatch and looked through the shattered viewport, the sky confirmed it. Above the smoking ruins, the orcs flew like carrion crows over a carcass. Their craft, ramshackle, ugly, stitched together from whatever they could salvage, filled the air in loose formation. Some trailed smoke, others fire, but they didn't fall. They never fell. They screamed across the sky, firing wildly at nothing and everything. And for everyone shot down by Imperial artillery, 2 more rose from the clouds below. The bombardment hadn't cleansed them. It had fed them. The fire had stirred something in the soil. Through the haze, I saw the ground ripple as if alive. Orcs crawling up through the craters, half-formed, covered in mud and ash, bellowing with laughter as they found weapons among the wreckage. The sky turned green not from spores this time, but from light. Every explosion, every burst of muzzle flash reflected through the haze until the air itself glowed with their color. It was as if the world had decided to become one of them. We sealed the hatch again and retreated into the dark. The child had started shaking. Sorn tried to calm her, offering a ration bar he'd been saving. She didn't take it. Her gaze was fixed on the tunnel ceiling, as if she could hear something the rest of us couldn't. An hour later, we heard it too, a scraping sound, faint but steady, echoing down the tunnel from the direction we'd come. I raised my laser gun, the beam of my glow rod cutting through the dark. The sound stopped, then came a voice, low, mocking. "Air, I smell Humy." The orc crawled into view a moment later, too big for the tunnel, hunched over, dragging a jagged cleaver behind him. His skin was slick with oil and blood, his eyes burning like coals in the dark. He must have followed us from the surface. How he'd fit through the maintenance shaft, I don't know. Or maybe he hadn't needed to. Maybe the world had simply reshaped itself around him. I fired. The las beam hit his chest, burned a hole clean through. He laughed. I fired again, and again, until the air filled with the sharp smell of ozone and scorched meat. The orc stumbled but didn't fall. He swung the cleaver, cutting a support beam in half with a single blow. The tunnel groaned. Galvin lunged forward with a welding torch, driving it into the orc's throat. This time it fell, its laughter turning into a bubbling gurgle before fading altogether. The silence that followed was thick. Then the ceiling cracked. We ran. The collapse swallowed the tunnel behind us, a roar of falling stone and twisted metal. Galvin went down first, caught in the debris. I turned back, tried to pull him free, but his metal limb had been crushed. His optics flickered once, then dimmed. "Seal it," he rasped. "Seal it or they'll find you," I did. The door closed with a hiss, cutting off the last of his light. We emerged hours later into a world that no longer resembled anything human. The bombardment had reshaped the landscape into a wasteland of glass and molten slag. Entire city blocks had melted into black rivers that steamed under the toxic rain. Above it all, the orcs still flew. Their laughter echoed down from the clouds, joined now by the rhythmic pounding of drums. There's something ritualistic about the way they fight. It isn't strategy, it's celebration. Every explosion, every scream, every act of destruction is part of their endless hymn to war. They don't fear death because they don't understand it. To them, every fallen orc is just another seed waiting to sprout. We made for the hills beyond the refinery belt. Soren carried the child. Corporal Nira limped behind us, her left arm hanging uselessly. We moved in silence, broken only by the distant thunder of guns and the occasional shriek of orc engines overhead. By the time we reached the ridge, night had fallen again. The horizon glowed with the light of hundreds of fires. In the center of it all, towering over the ruins, was something new, a fortress. The orcs had built it from the wreckage of our tanks and hab blocks, massive and obscene, crowned with banners painted in blood. And at its heart, I saw movement, a machine unlike any other, a walking behemoth of rusted steel and screaming engines, a gargant. It moved like a living thing, each step shaking the earth. Around it, the orcs gathered, chanting, roaring, firing their weapons into the air in celebration. It was creation through madness, order through chaos. They had taken our destruction and turned it into worship. Nira whispered something under her breath. A prayer, maybe, or a curse. I didn't ask which. Then the sky split open. A lance of light descended from orbit. A precise, surgical beam of plasma that turned everything it touched into molten glass. The Imperium had seen enough. Exterminatus hadn't been declared yet, but it was coming. The cleansing fire had begun. The orcs didn't retreat. They cheered. They threw themselves into the flames. I watched in disbelief as they ran toward the bombardment, arms raised, faces split with laughter. For them, it wasn't the end. It was proof. Proof that the galaxy itself was finally fighting back. And that made the war even better. That was when I realized something that's haunted me ever since. The orcs can't lose. Not truly. Even when they die, they win. Because war is all they are, and war is all the galaxy gives them. As the plasma storm rained down, I turned away, shielding the child beneath my coat. The heat washed over us, searing through the fabric, the air alive with static and ash. Soren screamed something I couldn't hear over the roar. When I looked again, the world was green light and fire, and in that light, I saw the shadows of the orcs still moving, still laughing, still rising. The sky itself had become theirs. By the third day, the fires stopped meaning anything. The land itself had become flame, a black sea of glass and ruin where the mountains bled smoke into the heavens. The bombardment from orbit hadn't ceased. It had simply changed rhythm, a slow, deliberate cadence that erased the last landmarks of civilization one by one. Manufactoria, hab blocks, defense grids, all reduced to molten rivers that cooled into jagged scars. Yet through it all, the orcs kept coming. You could see them through the haze, silhouettes moving against the inferno, their crude armor glowing red with heat. They should have burned. They didn't. They moved as if the fire itself were their element. Creatures born of chaos, sculpted by violence, unbroken by the very apocalypse that had been meant to end them. We'd taken shelter in a collapsed drainage conduit that cut through the northern ridge. The air was poison. My respirator's filters had failed hours ago, each breath scraping like sandpaper through my lungs. Soren had stopped speaking altogether. Nira's wounds had turned septic. She'd tied a piece of torn bandage around her, armed to slow the infection, but her skin was already black where the spores had taken root. The child, the one who never spoke, still followed us. Sometimes I wondered if she even needed to breathe. When the bombardment finally paused, the silence was worse than the fire. The sky glowed a dim, unnatural green, as if the spores themselves were reflecting light from the burning clouds. Every sound carried for miles: the drip of water, the groan of settling metal, the faint rhythmic laughter of orcs somewhere in the mist. I climbed the ridge that night, hoping to find a signal, anything. What I saw instead was impossible. The ground, charred, fused, cracked open by bombardment, was moving. Not from tremors or collapse. It was growing. In the craters where the plasma had struck deepest, new forms were taking shape. Orcs, grots, squigs, all half-born, their bodies steaming in the heat. Some clawed their way free and began fighting immediately. Others simply lay there, twitching, until the next wave of spores fell and awakened them. The war hadn't ended. The bombardment had only fertilized the field. I stumbled back, bile rising in my throat. Every instinct screamed to run, but there was nowhere to go. Behind me, Nira was praying softly to the Emperor, her voice breaking. "Deliver us from the Xeno," she whispered. "Deliver us from the fire." But even the prayers sounded hollow now. The Emperor's light did not reach this place anymore. Vargan 9 had been erased from the stars long before the final bombs fell. All that remained was the echo and the laughter of the green tide. At dawn, we saw the first of the orc airships rise through the haze. Massive, asymmetrical beasts of iron and fury, stitched together from wreckage and melted tank hulls. They rose on roaring jets of promethium flame, their sides painted with crude glyphs. They carried banners of skin and metal fluttering like trophies. Each engine cough and belch was a hymn to their gods, to Gork and Mork, or whatever nightmare those creatures prayed to. They didn't just rule the ground anymore. They owned the sky. Sorn watched one pass overhead, its shadow sweeping across the ruins like an eclipse. "They're building," he said, voice hoarse. "They're actually building again. After all this." Nira laughed, a dry, broken sound. "Of course they are. That's what they do. They turn ruin into joy." I wanted to tell her to stop, but she was right. The orcs don't need peace. They don't need victory. They just need conflict. It's their ecosystem, their religion, their heartbeat. By midday, the first orc patrols were scouring the hills. You could hear them before you saw them, the roar of their engines, the clash of metal, the shouts of their brutal camaraderie. We hid among the debris, motionless. The child crouched beside me, staring out at the world with an expression I couldn't read. When the orcs came into view, I felt that familiar sinking dread. They weren't just raiding anymore. They were organizing. I saw a war boss leading them, huge, armored in plates of scavenged ceramite, each one scorched and covered in crude glyphs. His jaw had been replaced with iron, his breath coming out in bursts of steam. Around him, the boys carried tools: welding torches, drills, cables, salvaged from Imperial manufactoria. They were constructing something, not fortifications, something larger. Sorn whispered, "A Gargant factory." I didn't ask how he knew. We both understood. The orcs were using the ruins to breed new machines, war engines that could walk through fire and laugh about it. They were turning Varganheim into a forge world, their own grotesque parody of the Mechanicus. That night, as the horizon glowed with fresh fire, Nira's fever broke. Her skin had gone gray-green, veins darkening beneath the surface. She looked at me once before it happened, a look of apology maybe, then screamed. Her body convulsed, twisting, cracking. Something inside her moved. The spores had found fertile ground. It took everything I had to raise the lasgun and pull the trigger. The beam burned through her chest, and for a moment, she was still. Then she smiled, the kind of smile you see only on the dead. Sorn buried her beneath a sheet of ferrocrete, muttering prayers that no one heard. The child didn't move. She just stood there, watching the smoke rise from Nira's body as if she were memorizing it. By morning, we decided to head for the old mag rail line. The orbital strikes were shifting north, and I hoped we could use the tunnels to reach the extraction point, if any still existed. The ground was soft beneath our boots, the soil slick with green oil. Every step left a print that shimmered faintly, like something alive. The mag rail station was half buried under rubble. The sign above the entrance had been melted by heat, the letters warped and unreadable. Inside, the air was still. Rows of burnt-out trains sat frozen on the tracks, their windows shattered. The silence was absolute, the kind that feels heavy, like the world is holding its breath. We descended into the platform area, using the glow rod's dim light. That's when we heard it. A whispering sound, faint, wet, organic. Sorn froze. The child tilted her head. I turned the light. The walls were pulsing. At first, I thought it was a trick of the glow rod, but then I saw them. Spore clusters, hundreds of them, pulsing like hearts, embedded into the concrete. Threads of green. Filaments spread across the walls and ceiling, feeding on moisture, growing toward us. The air shimmered with invisible particles, so thick it felt like breathing through liquid. We didn't speak. We just ran. The tunnels narrowed, twisting into maintenance shafts that led deeper underground. My chest burned with every breath, lungs raw from the spores. Behind us, the sound followed. A slow, wet rustling, like grass growing too fast. We emerged into an auxiliary chamber, an old cargo vault. The floor was covered in dust and skeletons. Human skeletons, still wearing tattered uniforms. There were markings on the walls, not orc glyphs this time, but Imperial script, scrawled in desperation. Purge failed. They grow underground. I looked closer. The bones weren't clean. They were fused to the floor, grown into it. Flesh and concrete had merged. That's when the lights flickered. Once, twice, and the vox crackled to life. A voice, distorted, distant. This is command. All remaining assets are to withdraw. Exterminatus protocol initiated. Repeat. Planetary purge authorized. Emperor, forgive us. Then silence. I looked at Sorn. His face had gone pale beneath the soot. We're not getting out, he said quietly. Outside, the world rumbled. The bombardment had resumed, but this time the explosions weren't orbital. They were planetary. Something deep beneath the surface was tearing itself apart. Magma vents opening, reactors overloading, tectonic plates splitting. The Imperium had decided to kill the world rather than risk letting it live. We climbed back to the surface to watch the end. The sky was no longer green or red. It was gold. The atmosphere burned away in a single sheet of light, brighter than anything I'd ever seen. The Ork fortress on the horizon cracked open, its towers bending, melting, collapsing into the sea of fire. Their laughter echoed until the very last second. But even as the world crumbled, I saw movement. In the molten glass, in the cracks of the dying ground, shapes still forming. Orks, half-born, clawing at the air, refusing to die. Sorn turned to me, eyes wide with disbelief. How do you kill something that doesn't understand death? I didn't have an answer. The child reached out then, her small hand pointing toward the horizon. I followed her gaze. In the light of the burning sky, I saw it. A shape rising from the molten plain. Vast and terrible. Not an orc, not a gargant, not even something you could name. A shadow stitched together from every scream, every explosion, every act of war that had ever scarred this planet. It moved once, slowly, like the heartbeat of something ancient. Maybe it wasn't real. Maybe my mind was breaking. Or maybe the orcs had finally done what no other species had managed. Made the world itself part of their war. The ground cracked beneath our feet. The fire roared higher. And through it all, I could still hear their laughter, echoing like a hymn that no god could silence. Varganheim wasn't dying, it was being reborn. The first thing I noticed after the sky went gold was the quiet that wasn't quiet at all. The world had been hammered into stillness by fire and vacuum, but something remained under the silence. A pressure, a murmur at the edge of hearing. Like a cathedral organ holding a single note long after the choir has bled away. It didn't come from above, where the last veils of atmosphere were still peeling off in sheets, or from the molten plains where gargantuan shadows crawled and died. It came from the ground itself, from the cracks in glass and slag that had once been avenues and manufactoria and prayer halls. It came from Vargan 9, and what Vargan 9 had become. Soren heard it too. He didn't say so, but his eyes kept moving to the same place as mine did. The seams in the earth that pulsed faintly green. The cooled rivers of glass where heat shimmered like breath. The child just watched the horizon, arms folded inside a coat far too large for her, as if the coat remembered warmth even if she didn't. When the wind came, it came wrong, a drag across the skin without weight, a suggestion of motion rather than the thing itself. The air was thin enough to make thought sting. "Can you walk?" I asked Soren, because questions keep people alive longer than silence. He nodded. Far as the rails, if they still exist. They did, in a manner of speaking. The magrail spur that once carried ore and men and faith to the refinery belt had been glassed into a black ribbon that climbed the northern escarpment like a road laid by a mad god. Every 100 meters it rose into the open where pylons used to stand. Every 100 meters it plunged into caverns that had been tunnels. The glass held, rippled, cooled into frozen waves that reflected the green underlight in warped patterns. I told the child to keep to the darker patches where the footing was better. She nodded and obeyed without a word. We walked. The sky dimmed from gold to ash to a green so pale it felt like memory. The bombardment shifted to the far side of the world, a distant percussion that made the ground thrum like a massive drumskin. Somewhere out there, Navy ships were finishing the arithmetic of death, counting down in plasma and void torpedoes until the planet's numbers balanced. I'd seen purges before, from distance and rumor. I'd never walked through one. The mind looks for borders to step over. A line between alive and ended, only to find there aren't any. Ending is a gradient. You walk it like a road. At the first break in the rails, we found the remains of a Mechanicus way station. 3 arches of blackened steel dangling from cables that had fused to the roof like veins. The door was a slab of ceramite, melted around the hinges, open just enough for a man to slide through sideways. Inside, the air smelled of fouled machine oil and cooked myrrh. The cog skull over the altar had been split down the middle. Someone had gone on kneeling until the fire reached them. Their bones were fused to the grate, hands still clasped, teeth clenched around the prayer they didn't finish. Galvin would have told me whether the station had a backline uplink, some subdermal artery to whatever fragment of logic engine might be left under the hills. Galvin was under a door somewhere in the tunnels, and the station had no light. I ran a gloved hand along the wall until I found a hardline jack, then the dead umbilical of a Vox. Dust fell in green glitter when I shook it. Soren tapped the casing, not because tapping fixes machines, but because tapping lets the hands do something that isn't killing or waiting to die. That was when the murmur changed. It came up through our boots this time, set the glass filings on the floor to dancing. Not rhythm, pulse. A call and answer too deep for hearing, too low to be anything but felt. Soren's eyes found mine in the dark. I felt my jaw clench around a truth I'd known since I fired my first shot on a world I will never see again. If a thing feels like war, if it moves like war, if it makes the body ready to fight without consulting the mind, then somewhere, someone is singing a battle hymn to a god with 1,000 names. We went back out under the thin sky. The horizon had rearranged itself while we were inside. Where I'd last seen a sprawling orc fortress cracking under bombardment, there was now a low field of irregular domes, as if some colossal mold had settled over the ruins and set. Shapes moved between them, hunched and jubilant. They shone when the underlight touched them. I had been a soldier long enough to recognize a staging ground even when it borrowed its geometry from sickness. They weren't supposed to be able to do this, Soren said. Not fear. Anger. The stupid humankind that punches when a wall refuses to admit it is a wall. Exterminatus burns the seed. That's the point. I thought of the administratum scrawl in the cargo vault. The sentence that had been both report and warning. Purge failed. They grow underground. Nothing the Imperium ever built went only one way. Fire drove plague into the roots. Roots drank fire like rain. They don't need a surface to begin, I said. They need a story to believe in. Soren blinked. Story. The Waaagh. The word came out of my mouth like a blasphemy and a catechism at once. The thing under their laughter. The thing that makes their junk fly and their guns fire and their dead not mean much. Call it field. Call it chorus. It's there. Like the Astronomicon. No. I swallowed the dryness in my throat. Wished I hadn't used that name at all. There are lights you don't bring down into the mud. Not a beacon. A crowd. A pressure. Not his light. Nothing like his light. And if any Imperial Creed scribe had walked with us at that moment, he would have cuffed me and made me write it out on parchment 1,000 times. The throne is singular. The beacon is singular. The Imperium's light knows the difference between rumor and radiance. I knew it too. But the war does not care what we know. It knows what we are. A figure broke from the domes and came loping across the glass. Big, even for their kind. The ceramite jaw gleamed where the last of the slag had polished it. A power claw buzzed and stuttered at his side, spitting sparks into the thin air. He raised a banner pole with a plate of skin nailed to it. The glyph on the plate hurt to look at, not because of any metaphysics I trust, but because it had been painted with something that remembered screaming. We ran. Not fast. I was keeping the child between us, watching the ground for places where the glass had set in razors, but fast enough to make the claw's buzz recede a little. The warboss bellowed. Others answered from the domes. The hymn under the ground rose. When I tell you I felt it push my legs to move faster, I mean the truth of the body. Fear is a lever. Pressure pushes. Men go. The glass road dove into the escarpment again, and we followed. The tunnel was half collapsed and thrumming. Not from aftershocks, from machinery. The sound came from far down, an engine too big for the space it had been shoved into, choking, running, choking again. The air tasted like hot pennies. I told Sorn to hold the child's hand. He did. Odd. The ease with which orders turn into mercy when they pass through the mouth of someone who's forgotten rank. We came to a place where wrecked carriages had concertinaed into each other, their armored bellies torn open to reveal seats full of ash. At the far end, where a pylon had punched through the roof, a glow wavered. Not pure green. A dirtier color, warmer, promethium flame. Or a torch. Or a generator design that should not have been running in a tunnel that had already survived a firestorm. I moved first, because that is what a sergeant does even when there is no company to sergeant for. Sorn followed, face gray with endeavor. The child did not stumble once. When we turned the last kink of broken steel, I almost raised my gun before my mind caught up with my eyes. Humans. 5 of them. What was left of a PDF detachment and a Vostroyan in a coat whose fur had been scorched down to polished leather. Their helmets sat on the floor around a drum stove fed with plastic crates that made the air sticky and sweet. An auspex set on the crate was wired to a wall panel by a dozen stolen cables. The auspex's needle danced in a way I had never seen. A skip-step stutter timed to a heartbeat none of us owned. The Vostroyan's mustache had gone to ash at the ends. He studied me down the barrel of a pistol as old as tradition, and then lowered it a fraction. Not to welcome us, but to remove the insult of a death we hadn't earned from touching his trigger. Name, he said, Corin. 2nd Cadian. Names are proofs. I turned my head toward Sorn. Private Sorn, 3rd of... I stopped. It didn't matter. Sorn's original unit had been ground fine and folded into other names on another world. Survivor. I nodded at the child. Sivian found sheltering in the hab blocks. No speech. No wounds I can find that explain the quiet. The Vostroyan listened like men listen to weather. He gestured with his pistol toward a coil of wire hung from a hook. Captain Bren, 19th. I think you tried to die into my Vox, Sergeant. The signal on your side died first. Your strike, I said. You said you were preparing a strike. We struck. His mouth did something that began as a smile and ended as an anatomy lesson. The orcs did not understand they had been struck. They enjoyed it. I nodded. Because there was nothing else to do with a truth like that but move around it like an obstacle you cannot lift. You're not the only signal we caught, Bren said, jerking a thumb at the auspex. You felt that, didn't you? The pulse, I said. The hymn, one of the PDF murmured. He was young enough that the green light made him look carved. All planes and no shadows. It gets inside your helmet. It is not a hymn, said a voice from the corner, rusty and filtered and half-holy terror by habit. The fuse burned like a lie you tell to steady a friend, short, hot, and honest. When it reached the drum, the promethium screamed in a way that made the cavern bones of the world vibrate. For a moment there was only the hiss and the thin, quick scent of burning rope and the faint memory of prayer. Then the tunnel filled with light the color of shame, and the ground answered with a sound that was not an explosion so much as a body finally giving up a secret it had been holding under its ribs. The blast did not behave like the orbital strikes. Those had been deliberate, clean as knives. This was jagged, a crooked tooth ripped from the planet's jaw. It boiled the air into a sickening steam that smelled of cooked metal and the iron sweet of human blood. Rock flayed and glass shattered into stars. The domes overhead kinked as if the planet itself had hiccuped. For a second every sound in the world lined up. The orcs' distant laughter, the warp hum of a dying auspex, the child's small gasp, and then they scattered into 1,000 separate things. Books of war measure explosions by radius and yield. Memory measures them by what they take from you. I remember the way light came at me from below the floor, as if the planet had opened its throat and been lit from within. I remember the crack of something vast, an engine, a belly of metal, separating with the noise of a cathedral door slamming. I remember Bren's pistol clattering from his hand and rolling into the dust like it had been shaken from a dead man's fingers. Soren's boots slipped on a sheet of glass that had been whole a heartbeat before. He caught himself on a rail and laughed once, a sound that might have been relief or madness. The child screamed, and the scream was small and human, and more terrible because it was still small. We ran because the world asked us to. We ran through a tunnel that had become a river of moving light, following the path of the rails as if they were promises. The pressure from the blast pushed our lungs into our throats. The heat baked the skin at the back of my neck until my hair felt braided in pain. Debris tumbled in the air like fallen cities. A Grot's corpse, torn into an abstract of teeth and wire, punched a hole through a beam above my head and left sparks that rained like confetti. For a moment, everything seemed to be falling away from its place. Sound, gravity, dignity, and I thought not for the first time that the world had changed how it wanted to be held. At the junction where we had planted the last drum, the structure had been flayed open. Promethium had eaten concrete like a beast and left the rails hanging across a black valley. The domes that had sheltered the Ork assembly were no longer domes but jagged, overturned bowls, their edges molten and dripping. From the gashes came the sound of things unmaking themselves, the creak of warped hulls, the yelp of engines coughing and filling with ash, the riotous, shocked laughter of orcs who had been given a surprise they liked because it was noisy. We heard the hymn fall away before we saw the casualty. The auspex, once a steady heartbeat beneath the floor, hiccuped and then stuttered into silence. The green shimmer that made everything hum like a hive went thin as a wounded drum skin. The orcs faltered mid-chant. Their movements lost coherence, like drunk men trying to dance to a rhythm someone else was supposed to keep. Engines groaned and then died. For a dizzying beat, the world felt less like a thing that wanted to eat us, and more like a machine that had been pried open and could be inspected. I told myself then that the blast had worked, that we had split their word in half. Bren laughed, a short, ugly sound wet with relief. The engine seer's jaw worked. He held his fingers to the ruined fuses, as if to check for a pulse. Sorn exhaled until the tunnel felt like someone had turned a faucet and let fear drain out. The child leaned against my shoulder and began to cry quietly. The way small things do when a fever breaks. It did not last. From the broken valley, a column of black smoke unfurled like the breath of something enormous. At its heart, a metal shape grew tall as a cathedral, half-welded, half-stitched, the ribs of human tank hulls forming a mockery of joints. Where the blast had split the domes, the orcs had already started to re-erect scaffolds, thundering like ants with hammers. Even broken, the gargant they had been assembling shifted a terrifying faith in itself. Its feet found purchase on the glassed railbed, belched a cough of steam, and wrenched one great leg forward, testing the world as if the planet were a rug it could shake. The engine seer swore in a language that had teeth, then gave a sound like someone rereading a coin. "We bought an hour," he said. He sounded smaller than before, like someone who had just been given a ration and knew it was inadequate for the journey. Bren did not answer. He had a look I knew too well, the look men get when they have to weigh the cost of hope. "We press higher," he said finally. "We reach orbital data or we die trying. We will not die in the dark with nothing played for." There is a courage that is cunning and a courage that is simply exhaustion. We had some of both. Sorn and I hoisted what we could carry. The Vostroyan and his men stripped the last of their plasteel boards to make a splint for Galvin when we found his trench of rubble. The engine seer carried with him a small box of cogitator plates, the kind that in other times are currency, and in this one are prayers. The child walked between us without help. Her bare feet left prints that steam rose from, and I watched them as if they might tell me where the world wanted to keep its memories. We climbed. The route was a ruin of staircases and rails and places where the planet had rolled like bread and decided the rising was unnecessary. The air thinned as we rose. The green light thinned with it too, like dye in water. At the lip of the escarpment the world laid itself open. The view was obscene and holy at once, a panorama of wreckage and stars, where the horizon had been chewed into a dozen notches and the orbital bombardment had left its teeth marks. Far below the gargant tested its other leg, each step a small earthquake that sent avalanches of glass down into the veils. From the open, a voice came over the ruined Voxnet, as if someone had turned the radio knob to a channel that had only known silence. It was thin at first, a frayed line that might have been a transmission or a prayer. Then it steadied into something like a hand being laid flat upon a table. This is Admiral Lask with the Judgment's Hand. We are holding in high orbit. The planetary purge is not complete. There are survivals. We have orders to— The message clipped as if the sender had been cut with shears. Static ate the rest. Bren looked at me. Admiral, hold? I guessed. Hold, Bren echoed. His voice was low because it had to be. Either the purge is delayed, or more likely the Admiralty has found value in counting the survivors. It's how they measure souls now. Inventory before salvage. Counting survivors is an act of bureaucratic mercy wrapped in calculation. I did not like the way the words settled on the edge of my tongue. The child tightened her grip on my sleeve and leaned into the wind as if the motion made sense of the world. What do we do? She asked, and her voice was small enough that I wanted to give her a cloak and the horizon and a different fate entirely. We move, Bren said. We buy ourselves to a point the Judgment's Hand can see as useful. Then we signal with human noise. We make ourselves inconvenient to erase. There is a greed poet's rarely name, the greed to be inconvenient. It is the human desire to be impossible to ignore. We packed in silence, the kind of silence that is work and not thought. When we moved, the Gargant tested another stride, and the ground bled green where its tread cracked the railbed. Ork engineers, mechs probably, clawed at the exposed joints, cursing and spitting and welding with the focused joy of men making something they will be proud to break again. We skirted the creature's shadow, kept low where the melted rail cast a kind of map of dark and cooler places. The child stepped in a slit of light and then bounded out like some small animal deciding its world by hops. Her feet were raw, but she did not complain. She hummed a song that was not ours. I could not tell if it was a memory or a future being invented as she sang. It kept time with our steps, and something about the cadence steadied me the way discipline had when I was young and believed that order might be preserved. When we reached the ridge where the mag rail crossed a ravine, a shape broke the skyline and made every breath a mistake. Not a Gargant this time, but a thing that wore armor like a city wears a wall, a construct of orc iron and scavenged artillery, with a head like a furnace and a mouth that spat flame. It had the scale of a siege engine and the humor of a mob. It stomped, and the sound rolled like thunder softened through wool. Around it, orcs gathered in a ring, raising their crude weapons to the air, and beating drums made from the stretched hides of animals from worlds I had never meant to name aloud. They chanted, and the chant tried to be a hymn but came out as a dare. The hymn, which we had thought to have been sundered, had found new threads to sew itself with. New voices, new engines, new instruments. Bren cursed under his breath and looked at the auspex in the engine seer's pack. The needle had recovered from its shock and now thrummed with a different cadence, one that matched the wall of sound pouring from the orc ring. They are patching, he said. They will be back to speed in less than an hour. Then we go now, I said. Bren nodded. Now, we slid down the far side of the ridge, taking advantage of the ruined cover. We found the spine of the world, where the rails climbed out of the escarpment and turned into a run of pylons that had once shouldered vox relays and traffic beacons. Up close, they looked less like towers and more like bones jutting from a charnel field. White, where the heat had scoured them clean. Black, where Promethium had licked and left its kiss. At the highest point, a crown of antennae still clung to the masthead, warped and half-melted, but whole enough that a man could look at it and imagine light. Bren shaded his eyes with the back of his hand, the ash on his glove making a gray smear across his brow when he lowered it. If anything can be made to shout, he said, it's that. The engine seer ran a mechadendrite along a buckled feeder trunk and made a sound that was not quite a blessing, and not quite an insult. It will not be pretty. It will be loud. Loud is what gets counted, Bren said, and that settled the doctrine. We took the slope in a zigzag that kept us low whenever the Gargant's head swung our way. It had turned from testing to walking, an infant god learning how to stamp. Every step sent a tremor through the ridge, a grinding complaint that shook sand from the seams of my armor and rattled old prayers loose inside my skull. The orc ring below had thickened into a carnival of labor. Mechs on gantries, grots in swarms, boys ferrying tank hulls like ants shouldering rib bones. Their drums had found a new pulse. The auspex needle jittered and climbed. The climb was a study in careful lies we told our legs. I promised mine there would be a place to rest at the top. They pretended to believe me. Sorn went first with a length of cable the engine seer insisted we would need. The child followed him, her bare feet sure on glass that would have sliced a softer world. Bren came last, covering the rear with the patient, lethal boredom of a man for whom retreat is just another vector for fire. At the base of the mast, the metal had bubbled and set like a frozen wave. The ladder was a suggestion more than a structure. Rungs missing, rungs bent into hooks, rungs that would tear a glove if you trusted them. We went up anyway. Halfway to the platform, a gust rolled across the ridge and set the whole tower to humming. The sound tuned itself to the note that had been living under the silence since the sky went gold. The child pressed a hand to the metal and frowned. "It's in this too," she said. "What is?" Soren asked. "The laughing," she said, and there was no poetry in the way she said it, only the plain report of a censor that had learned speech. At the platform, the world opened and I had to take a breath that wasn't there. The horizon was a broken comb. The Gargant strode between the teeth. Beyond it, fire walked where the Navy still worked the far hemisphere. Over us, a slice of the emptiness between stars showed through a seam in the cloud. A strip of black so clean it made the green haze look like oil. The engine seer fell to work the way a priest falls to his knees. He spoke to the metal, which is to say he named things until they remembered their names. He stripped insulation where the heat had charred it into sugar. He married a live feeder to a dead grid with a length of cable Sorn had dragged up from the railbed. He lashed a cracked Auspex coil to the tallest of the antennas with copper wire and a promise. When he asked for plastic shims, I fed him ration cards. When he asked for a conductive plate, I gave him a fragment of aquila from a broken shoulder pauldron. He looked at it for a second longer than he had to, then slid it into the rig and tightened it down with a prayer his Vox grill could not keep from sounding like grief. "What do you give it if you want the Admiral to hear your name?" he asked. "And not the song the orcs sing through your bones?" "Human noise," Bren said. "Recognition codes from the Navis Lex. Flares if the sky will carry them. And if none of that delivers, a shape they cannot pretend not to see." "An aquila," Sorn said, glancing at the plate the engine seer had just buried in the heart of the lash-up. "Not painted," Bren said. "Burned," we did both. The child sat cross-legged beside the coil with her hand hovering a finger's breadth above its cracked glass. Eyes half-lidded like those of a navigator staring into a star they would never admit was a wound. The rest of us scrounged the platform for anything that would burn bright and colored. Signal dies stored in a box that had fused shut and yielded only when Sorn spoke to it with a pry bar. A spool of flare line that might scorch the sky a little if we begged it. Promethium slopped into an old service pan and set in a shape that any Navy lieutenant with a soul left would be loath to ignore. The engine seer popped a panel and showed me the teeth inside. "When I close this," he said, "it will bite. Angle the dish by hand and keep it there. If it swings off axis, we will be shouting into our own heads." "Axis," Sorn said. The engine seer pointed with a steel finger to the seam of clean black between the clouds. "There," he said simply. He closed the panel. The mast woke up wrong. It did not hum like a healthy machine. It groaned like a wounded one proceeding anyway. Current ran through our lash-up in a dirty wave that made my molars fizz. The coil bloomed to life with a halo of coronal discharge. The Auspex needle buried itself, and the air around the platform filled with the smell of hot copper and old rain. The child flinched, and then pressed her palm a fraction closer to the glass. The muscles in her jaw working the way a soldier's do when he carries a weight that does not show. "On the mark," Bren said, and his voice was the voice of a man announcing something to the dead, so they could feel included. "Transmit." The engine seer struck the Vox keys with a rhythm that had been hammered into men's hands at Skole, since before our regiments knew their banners. Bren leaned over the mic and gave his name the way one gives his oath. Slowly, so that it could not be misunderstood. Firmly, so that it could not be ignored. "This is Captain Bren, 19th Vostroyan, acting in concert with survivors of the 2nd Cadian and Vargan 9 PDF. We are alive. We are positioned on the northern escarpment at Railmast 4-1. We have sight on enemy Gargant assembly and active wall field. We request designation as a live asset under Judgment's operational purview. We request instruction or extraction. We will accept munitions. We will accept a reason to keep counting." The sky did not answer. It thickened, perhaps out of embarrassment. "Again," Bren said. We sent it again, and this time the child hissed and clutched the coil and said, "It pushes back." "What does?" "The laughing." Her voice broke into two, like a wire that parts and keeps singing. "It doesn't want your word to go. It wants its word to be the only one the sky listens to." The engine seer's hands tore at the panel again, found a bypass, forced it. "Then we cut the laughter where we can," he said through clenched teeth. "We bleed it into metal. Child, hum if you can. Anything that is not them." She obeyed with the obedience of someone who has very little left to lose. The sound she made at first was thin and uncertain, a thread in wind. Then it steadied into something plain and old. The kind of tune a mother sings not because it is art, but because doing so means her hands are still hers. It did not fight the him below. It refused it. The coil's halo narrowed. The needle, which had been choking at its peg, dropped half a nail's breadth and quivered there. Bren leaned into the mic and sent our names into the seam of clean black again. Sorn and I held the dish steady against the wind. The Prometheum Aquila burned at our feet and threw up sparks like a failing star. The mast shuddered under a distant impact, the Gargant stamping maybe, or the orc drums agreeing, and the dish tried to swing away. We wrenched it back until my shoulders screamed. The first answer came as a click. Not a word, not even a tone you'd trust. A click like a pin being pulled. Then a voice, thin with distance and proud for no good reason. Copy. Railmast, 4-1. This is Judgment's Hand Tactical Aux. Identify with code phrase. Bren's mouth worked once like a man trying to swallow an emotion the Skola never taught him what to do with. Then he gave the phrase the Navy had put in sailors' ears since before our ancestors learned to be uncomfortable on land. Against the void, he said. The answer did not come right away. When it did, it came with the relief of a door opening in a corridor you had been sure was a cul-de-sac. And the void looks back. Aux here. Your signal is weak and interfered. Say position relative to prominent enemy engine. Bren glanced at me. I glanced at the Gargant. South by east of primary engine, elevation plus 400. Visual confirmation of mech activity and ring assembly. We have compromised substructure with Prometheum charges. Field amplitude fluctuating. Understood. Asset acknowledged. Stand by for ordnance on coordinates Mark 1 through Mark 3. There are sentences so sweet that even the air around them seems to cool. Ordnance on Mark. A hand you can't see, closing itself around an enemy you can. We would have misbehaved with joy if the world had given us the time. It didn't. The mast's shadow changed. Things that had looked like slag outcrops were moving, heads low, hands full of knives that promised silence. Commandos. They came out of the skin of the ridge the way good killers do, as if the ground had been rehearsing the trick for them all day. The first was on Sorn before we looked down. Sorn took the knife in his shoulder, and the gab on its hilt in the teeth, and answered with his bayonet as if the steel were an opinion he had been waiting to deliver to someone who would finally listen. Engines arrived like an argument the sky had been saving. You felt them before you heard them. Pressure first, then a thin, searing thread of sound that slipped between the teeth of the weird boy lightning and pulled the air taut. The mast vibrated with it. The coil's halo tightened to a knife edge. The child's hand shook and did not move. They came skimming the seam of clean black, dark silhouettes against darker emptiness. Nav lights hooded, weapons bright. Gunships in navy livery, broad-winged, brutish, all function and malice. They rolled to present their bellies, and the world below us bloomed. The first pass stitched white fire across the weird boy circle. Where the beams met flesh, laughter turned into a noise like metal cooling too fast. Crack, groan, silence. Green lightning hiccuped, reached for the sky, and found it did not want them anymore. The second pass raked the Gargant's knees. Armor the size of cathedrals sprouted molten petals and fell away in slabs, revealing the stolen spines of Lehman Russ hulls welded together into a joke about tendons. The behemoth staggered, caught itself with one hand, and punched the ground in fury. The shockwave hit the mast a heartbeat later. The platform bucked. The dish twisted in my hands like a living thing that had decided I was a worse idea than the alternative. Sorn leaned his weight into the struts, jaw locked, eyes slitted against the wind of the strikecraft. Bren kept speaking into the mic with a voice he must have trained in rooms with marble floors and proper air. Unflinching, unfazed, naming our position over and over as if repetition could nail us to existence. The weird boys died untidily. Those who survived the first burn tried to stand and found only their shadows willing. A few sent arcs skyward in reflex. The gunships rolled, let the lightning lick their armored skins, and came around again, lower this time, meaner. Heavy bolter rounds walked through the orc ring, kicked up green and black, tore banners, turned drums into splinters and awful. Somewhere behind the pulse of fire, I thought I heard a pilot laughing with the lethal glee of a man whose job at last matched his training. Our mast sang in sympathy. The coil wavered. The Auspex needle, which had been pinned high by fury and held lower by the child's plain little song, began to tremble in a way that made my wrist ache. The engine seer flared the bypass a fraction more and took a spark to the cheek. The flesh there puckered and darkened, and he did not notice. "Hold it!" he ground out. And I did, because there was nothing else worth doing except dying, and I had resolved not to make a habit of dying until I had gotten a few more things wrong on purpose. Commandos came again, because habits are what make a species survive. They came up the mast like disease through wire. Gray paint flaking, teeth clamped on blades to leave hands free for climbing. Bren put 2 down with the reflexive mercy of a man who prefers neatness. The third swung onto the platform directly in front of the child, too close to shoot without giving the coil a new religion in shrapnel. I did the impolite thing and stepped where he meant to be, and offered him my pauldron instead of my throat. He took the offer, chopped, found ceramite, and hissed. I put the bayonet under his ribs, and when his laugh tried to continue despite the interruption, I introduced his lungs to the open air. We argued briefly about whether that was a kindness. He fell. The child didn't look at him. She was watching the seam in the sky, mouth open, humming through blood and grit, eyes full of stubborn. The gunship's third run was freighter low. Rockets skittered into gantries. The mechs that hadn't been burned apart fell from their perches, arms windmilling, tools glinting in short, comedic descents that ended in red and green. The Gargant howled, a sound like a furnace realizing it had bones. Something enormous inside it let go. An engine coupling, a dream, and a gout of fire shot from its flank. The Ork ring roared approval, as if failure were another kind of success. The hymn fell a step, caught itself, fell again. Pressure eased off my skull the way a hand withdraws from a child's forehead when a fever finally breaks. For one honest breath, I thought we had stolen a minute from a god. Asset mast 4-1. The thin voice crackled in our headset, clearer now, impatient as a surgeon with too few hands. We see you. You are designated. Keep transmitting. We are pushing a corridor across your hill. You have 90 seconds to move before the orcs decide to own the sky again. 90 seconds, Bren said, and for once the number arrived like a gift. Down, the engine seer rasped. We must decouple or the dish will call to the wrong ears after we leave. We need the mast alive, Bren said. And even as he said it, we both knew the mast wasn't ours any longer. It would belong to whichever story reached it next. The child swayed. The coil's halo feathered. Her hand had blistered where it pressed the glass. Clear fluid ran and sizzled. I knelt and put my hand over hers without touching the coil. We're leaving, I said. You did it. She blinked at me as if waking from a task that had required all of her body to be an instrument. She nodded once, an adult's nod, and pulled her palm away. The halo blew out like a candle. The Auspex needle slumped to a posture that made it look suddenly ashamed. The engine seer ripped the bypass free. The mast's lights guttered. Metal sighed. We gathered the coil, the vox, the battered Aquila plate, and slung them across our backs as if relics were just weight after all. Bren took point down the ladder. Sorn came next. I lowered the child until her feet found the rung, and then followed with a back that felt older than the hills. Behind us, the Gargant found its stance again, with the sulky determination of a giant denied a tantrum. Halfway down, the wind changed. It carried something hard and fast and laughing. Iron strapped to meat, rocket motors, a choreography of bad ideas. The roar was wrong for gunships. It had punctuation. A black shape slashed across the platform and clipped a rung near Sorn's boot with a knife that sparkled like a dare. Stormboys, orcs who pretended. Discipline had virtues and strapped rockets to their backs to prove that rules could be weaponized. 7 of them in a V that scattered the air like birds forgetting they were rock. They came around for the second pass with ugly grace. One went high to cut the dish free entirely and steal our mouth for his own joke. 2 came low, hands out, grabbing. A third dove for the child, and I saw the future in which he carried her away like a mascot into their ring. I let go of the ladder, caught the Stormboy's forearm with both hands, and let his speed finish the work my strength could not. He tore himself off the flight plan and smashed into the mast, leaving paint and skin and blood and a long smear of someone's stanza across our platform. Sorn took a blade in the calf and swore with the creativity soldiers reserve for moments when the universe tries to teach them about humility. Bren shot one Stormboy through the rocket and turned him into a parable about why not all energies are equal under heaven. The remainder scattered, chattered something that might have been drill and might have been glee, and returned to their loop. Move, Bren snarled, his voice wearing a shape that put speed in the bones. We did. We went to ground hard and ugly. The last drop to the glassed ridgeline knocked the wind out of me and put grit in places grit did not belong. I grabbed the child and rolled. The Stormboys came a third time to take offense that we still existed. The gunships finally noticed them. Navy wrath is a clean thing when it is close. One gunship peeled away from its line and took a viciously elegant angle up the ridge, cannon steady, engines trimmed like a surgeon adjusting his scalpel. Its guns cut a line through the orcs on the wing. The first Stormboy tried to dodge and misread the conversation. He became component parts and a memory. The second attempted some artistry, vaulted the line of fire, and discovered that tracers paint your name in the air for a reason. The third banked straight at us with admirable spite. Bren dragged the child behind a brace. I threw myself over the engine sear. Sorn lifted the coil like a shield even though it was dead. The Storm Boy's rocket burned out at the last instant. His momentum died, and he fell at our feet with a grin still nailed to his face. He tried to stand and found his body expressing other priorities. I put him down, quick and formal. The gunship climbed. The second fell in behind it. Together they laced the ridge with fire that owed no one an apology. The Storm Boys dissolved into streaks and jokes. The Gargant's head turned to track the gunships with the puzzled rage of a monster discovering gnats have teeth. It reached for them with a limb armored in tank doors, and found the air was less obedient than the ground. "Corridor open," the Ork Waaagh said in our ears, breathless with the joy of getting it mostly right. 2 clicks south by east. "You have a window. Take it. We will walk you with fire." Bren pointed and we obeyed. There was no dignity left in our movement, only urgency arranged in human limbs. The ridge ran like a spine toward a saddle that cut the horizon into 2 meanings. Every time the Gargant stamped, dust rolled in sheets and the hill complained. Ork rounds snapped past, angry insects with ideas about our futures. The gunship stood between us and the worst of it, laying down curtains of tracer and stitched curtains of white that sewed the air shut in places we hadn't planned to walk anyway. We reached the saddle breathing knives. The world beyond it opened into a sloping basin, where the bombardment had spared circles of ground the size of landing markers. 12 minutes can be the lifespan of a battle or the time it takes to learn what kind of silence a world leaves behind. In the gunship's belly we counted both. The engines kept a low growl beneath our feet, a reminder that the sky was still something you had to earn. The air smelled of burnt oil and adrenaline. It carried the taste of blood that wasn't all ours. No one spoke at first. Words would have been a betrayal. Bren sat across from me, helmet off, face gray except for the raw lines the goggles had spared. He held the data plate against his chest like a confession he hadn't yet decided how to word. Sorn's head lolled against the bulkhead, eyes half open, skin waxy. The child slept on my lap, fingers twitching as though tracing invisible maps. Every few breaths her lips moved, counting again maybe. Counting to stay awake, even in dreams. Through the view slit the world was still on fire. The ridge where the mast stood was a candle guttering in wind. Flames climbed it like penitents on a stair, the mast's bent silhouette bowing under their weight. And yet, between the intervals of smoke and shell light, the top still shone. A spark, small, defiant. The engine sear's fire. He hadn't gone quietly. Did he light it? Sorn murmured. Yes, Bren said. He lit it. The gunship pitched slightly as the pilot adjusted course. Above us, the Judgment's hand swelled into view. A blade of gold against the void, vast and patient. You could almost forget that it was just another engine of the Emperor's will, built for ending more than saving. As we approached, the comms crackled alive, and the same clipped naval voice returned, this time less like a stranger. "Asset, confirm crew count." Bren answered with numbers that didn't add up. The silence that followed was longer than protocol allowed. Then, copy. Proceed to docking bay 8. Medici on standby. It should have sounded like deliverance. It didn't. The hand received us in ritual quiet. Tech priests waited with censers, swinging incense to hide the scent of charred armor. White-robed Medici took Sorn and the child without ceremony. I started to follow, but Bren's hand caught my arm. "Not yet," he said. "You're still part of the report." The phrase landed like a stone. Part of the report. In the Imperium, that's how survival is measured. Not by breath or pulse, but by whether your story fits the column of data that someone will read and never feel. They led us through corridors where the walls hummed with the ship's heart. The deck beneath our boots vibrated with the same steady rhythm as the cannons we'd heard in orbit. No matter how vast the vessel, you could always feel its hunger for obedience. We entered the Strategium, a room carved in brass and prayer, hollow maps burning faintly in the incense-thick air. An admiral waited there, his uniform immaculate, his eyes tired. He didn't rise. "Captain Bren," he said. "Sergeant Corrin, you've made yourselves loud." Bren saluted. "Sir." We transmitted coordinates and Lev field data. Vargan 9 remains under hostile reconstitution. The Gargant is crippled, but the Waaagh field persists. The Admiral steepled his fingers. "We've seen the readings." The field's amplitude dropped briefly. Then it adapted. "Do you know what that means?" I thought I did. It meant the laughter had learned. Bren stayed silent. The Admiral's gaze shifted to me. "You were on the ground when the field fractured." "Yes, my lord." "What did you hear?" The question was surgical. It wasn't curiosity. It was extraction. "Not words," I said. "A pressure. Like a storm thinking about where to land." It wasn't one voice. It was thousands agreeing to exist at the same time. When it cracked, it didn't stop. It listened. The Admiral nodded slowly, as if confirming a rumor he'd already dreaded. "The Orks learn faster now." Every failed purge teaches them something. They've started imitating coherence, mimicking strategy. When we burn them, the ash remembers. Bren clenched his jaw. Then what's the order, sir? Exterminatus remains authorized, the Admiral said. But not yet. We're retrieving every scrap of intelligence your engine seer left. If there's a pattern, if we can find a way to mute their chorus, we'll use it. Otherwise, he gestured toward the void. The Emperor's mercy is fire. The words hung between us like a sentence already carried out. When he dismissed us, Bren stayed behind. He had the look of a man who wanted to argue with hierarchy and was too tired to remember how. I left the strategium in silence, found my way to the medici deck. The child lay on a cot, her burned hand wrapped in synth bandage that glowed faintly blue. Sorn was asleep beside her, chest rising shallow but steady. The room smelled of antiseptic and sanctity. I sat beside her until her eyes fluttered open. "Did we stop them?" she whispered. "For now," she frowned, small and serious. "Then they're only waiting." There was no comfort honest enough to give. I looked past her at the viewport where Vargan turned slowly below us, half shadow, half flame. The firelight ran along the edges of the world like veins under skin. You could almost see it breathing. That night, if time still had meaning in orbit, I dreamed of the laughter again. It came through the static of the gunship's vox, faint, distant, yet perfectly clear. It wasn't joy, it was endurance. When I woke, the ship was shaking. Sirens clawed at the air. I stumbled to the viewport. Vargan was brighter, too bright. The purge had begun. Fire fell in lines so straight they looked drawn by a god's ruler. Oceans boiled, continents folded. Cities that had already died were granted the mercy of vanishing. And above it all, the Admiral's voice came over the vox, solemn and final. "By the authority of the High Lords, the Emperor's light redeems what cannot be cleansed. Vargan is consigned to silence. But even as the world broke, I swore I could still hear it. The faintest echo of that impossible hymn, rising from the ash, finding shape in the fire. The silence fought back, and somewhere, deep in the flames of a dying world, the orcs were laughing again. The purge did not sound like triumph. It sounded like paperwork finally catching up with a sin. Cyclonic torpedoes bloomed in the black like cold flowers and unfolded their meanings into the crust. And Vargan gave those meanings back as light. The judgment's hand shuddered at measured intervals while lances fired, the deck humming with the steadiness of a cathedral organ that had studied restraint. Men on the gunnery decks muttered litanies with lips that knew each word was both prayer and procedure. In the medici bay, under white lamps that refused metaphor, the child slept with her burned hand raised on a sling, and Sorn dreamed with his eyes open. I stood at the viewport and tried to understand a world ending. I had seen cities fall, hives split, void ships vented to write names in frost across the stars. Those were endings with edges. This was the slow, careful breaking of a circle. Oceans wore steam like shrouds. Mountain chains lifted and slid. New scars crossing old until the surface looked like a scroll overwritten too many times to read. Every so often a section flared brighter. The moment a vault cracked, a reactor went honest. A manufactorum's hoarded poisons met air and became sermons. The Admiral had said exterminatus with the tone of a man signing his own will. He had given us 12 minutes to decide if we intended to continue breathing. We had spent them counting. Now, there was only the arithmetic of fire. Bren found me with the data plate cradled like a saint's bone. He had slept in the way officers do, eyes closed just long enough to convince the men that time still had corners. He did not look at the viewport. He had finished with vistas. "They want the names," he said. "Of the survivors," I said. "And the dead." He turned the plate in his hands, thumb running the edge where machine oil had stained the cogwork into a permanent shadow. "The Mechanicus will scrape this clean for patterns. The Navy will scrape it for targets. The Ministorum will scrape it for phrases to fit into sermons about duty and flame. The Administratum will scrape it for a number that balances against the munitions ledger." "What do you want it scraped for?" His mouth did a thing between smile and wound. "To make certain someone has to say them aloud." The ship announced a course adjustment in the measured voice that ships use when they wish to be forgiven for physics. Grav plates shifted. Not enough to throw a man, but enough to make him step nearer to something that could be held. I braced a hand against the frame. "Your engine seer," Bren said, and left it there. Not a question. Not a comfort. "He finished his prayer," I said. Bren nodded once, the way men nod when they refuse to develop the habit of bowing. "The Admiral wants us in strategium again." The room was warmer this time, or I was colder. Hololiths moved like stained glass given new ambitions. Layers of data stacked into a mockery of transparency. A robed choir of tech priests whispered to their god through cables and code. Translating the planets dying into numbers that would go on living long after breath was a rumor. The Admiral had not slept. He sat like a statue that remembered who it had been carved for. Captain Bren, Sergeant Corrin. No preface now. We had been filed. Bren offered the plate. The Admiral did not take it. He gestured to a servitor whose hands had been replaced with instruments that looked like instruments. The thing approached with the reverent tread of a penitent. Bren held the plate a second longer, then let it go. The servitor slid it into a mouth in its chest and made a sound like a hymn translated into mathematics. "We found the pulse you spoke of," the Admiral said. "Your act." A nod that included the map of tunnels, the drums, the fire, the child's small stubborn hand. Broke it. Not a silence. A hesitation. The orcs learned the shape of the break faster than we anticipated. "They listened," I said. "They always listen," the Admiral said calmly, as if discussing weather. "That is the heresy of underestimation. We have taught ourselves to ignore what we do not like to name. The orc is not only appetite. Appetite would be simpler. Appetite does not memorize." He inclined his head toward the screen where the planet's surface writhed. "We have committed. The purge will proceed to terminality. But your data suggests there are intervals. Call them rests between notes, where the field is thin, long enough to send a blow through without the laughter catching it and making it a joke." "Windows," Bren said. "Slits." The Admiral's mouth creased. "You poured promethium into the seam of one. We can put something larger into the next." "Lances?" I asked. "If geometry allows," the Admiral said. "Cyclonics if not. There is a cost." His gaze moved past us to the hollows where trajectories and prayers merged into straight lines. "We will prolong the purge. We will give the ash time to remember." "It already does," Bren said. The Admiral looked weary enough to be forgiven for the honesty that followed. "Then let it remember that we answered." We stood in that sentence for a while. "Another matter," he said finally, and now his eyes found mine in a way I did not enjoy. "The child. Your report notes sensitivity." "She heard weight where the auspex read pressure," I said. "She centered the coil when Weird Boy Lightning tried to unmake your mouth." The Admiral's tone remained gentle the way a laser cutter is gentle. Precise, unhurried, not given to waste. "Untutored, unregistered, unburned. I have instructed Medici to move her under the purview of the Scholastica Psychona as a precaution. Precautions save lives." "Sometimes," I said. He did not flinch. "Sometimes. Meanwhile, your presence at her side has value. She seems to believe your voice sounds like safety." I thought of the orphan prayers that had collected behind my teeth since I was 12, and decided to accept the slander. "I'll sit with her." "You'll do more than sit," he said. "You will listen. If she hears the pressure thin, you will tell me before the auspex does. We will treat human perception as signal until it fails us." "Rumor as instrument," Bren murmured. Not to argue, but to see how the phrase tasted. "We live in a rumor written with guns," the Admiral said. "Dismissed." Back in the Medici Bay, the child was awake, watching a pig feed on a portable slate with the absorbed patience of someone who had learned to see while the world shouted. The feed wasn't meant for her. It showed a grainy view of the mast. Still there, still crooked, still flickering with stolen power in gusts, as the purge wind bent flame out of true. Tiny shapes streaked the ridge sometimes, orc silhouettes with rockets and opinions, but the mast persisted the way a lie does when enough men tell it for long enough. She looked up when we entered. The blue of the synth bandage made her skin seem warmer by contrast. "Is he in there?" she asked, nodding at the slate with the serene cruelty of children who refuse to name ghosts. "He is where finished prayers go," I said. It was not the answer any creed would have approved, but it did not lie. She nodded. It seemed she had a list of answers she could live with and placed that one among the better sounding. "Can you hear it?" I asked. "The laughing?" She listened, her brow folded into small, earnest furrows. "It's far. Like when you press your ears and hear the blood. It pushes when the lights all go together. It doesn't know how to be one thing for long. It forgets and then remembers and then forgets remembering." "Intervals," I said, blinking. She held up her unburned hand and opened and closed it. "When it closes, it tries to be heavy. When it opens, it falls. It doesn't like falling." Bren met my eyes over her head. The Admiral's slits. The vox above our heads clicked, and the ship spoke in a tone it reserved for orders that were also hopes. "All batteries stand by for sequenced lance fire on Admiral's mark. All craft, ready for oblique suppression at coordinates Omega 7 through 10. Engine room, hold phase adjustment at 91. Mark," the ship's bones thrummed. The stars outside drew their shoulders in. On the slate, the mast shuddered. coughed sparks, and briefly, improbably, shone like a thing that had been meant to be beautiful. Now, the child said softly, eyes unfocused, a navigator pointing into a wound. Now, I keyed my bead. Strategium, this is Corin on Medici. Child confirms thinness. I hated the sound of the sentence even as I loved what it gave us. Now. We are already there, the Admiral's voice answered, with a grace I had not expected. Watch, we did. The first lance cut across the continent with the malicious elegance of a thought that had decided to be action. The second bit deeper where rock remembered being fluid. The third and fourth came as a crossing pair that made the ground argue with itself. Through the view slit, I saw the Ork fortress crater fold inward like a mouth denying food. On the slate, the mast flared once more and then vanished under steam and light. For a breath that tried to be a minute, the pressure vanished. The gun deck sighed. Men on the line let their shoulders ask permission to drop. I did not let mine. The child squeezed my sleeve once, brief and fierce, then went quiet again, eyes half closed as if listening for a footstep in snow. It's angry, she said. Not big angry, small angry, like when you take a toy. They will build a new joke about the toy, Bren said. They always do, I said. The purge went on. The intervals came less often as magma reached places maps had not imagined, and the air thickened into sermons about consequence. The laughter weakened, reconfigured, returned thinner. The weird boy pulses sputtered like bad neon. In between, pockets of humanity made their last noises. Coded bursts from shelters that hadn't collapsed yet. Flares painting insult onto the smoke. A single hymn from a chapel somewhere under rock.